do you think you are? Pretending to be a cop!
"6:47 in the morning found the city of Westbridge still wrapped in a thin gray mist, the kind that clung to streetlights and made the flag above the police headquarters hang heavy and still. A black woman in a worn but neatly pressed uniform walked toward the front gate carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder, her steps unhurried, her eyes taking in every detail of the building, the way a person studies something they intend to know completely. A white lieutenant stepped into her path before she reached the doors, his jaw tight, his voice already sharp with suspicion. He told her to stop pretending to be an officer. What happened in the next 10 seconds would echo through the department for months to come, because a sound rang out across the parking lot loud enough to silence the dozens of officers gathered for morning formation, and a police cap rolled across the concrete and came to rest beside a puddle from the night's rain. None of them knew that the woman who had just been struck in front of her future colleagues was the very person the mayor had appointed, only days earlier and in complete secrecy, to become the new chief of police for the entire city. And in 20 minutes, every single person who had stood there and watched would wish they had never come to work that day. Her name, though almost no one in Westbridge had heard it yet, was Naomi Ellison. She was 43 years old, a woman who carried herself with the quiet economy of someone who had spent 2 decades learning that the loudest person in the room was rarely the most dangerous one. Before Westbridge, she had spent 22 years in federal service, the last several of those running an investigative unit that specialized in rooting out corruption inside police departments across 3 states. She had built a reputation, not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that made careers end quietly and permanently once her name showed up in an internal memo. Nobody in this department had ever laid eyes on her, and that had been by design. The mayor's office had kept her appointment sealed until the morning of her official swearing in, worried that word leaking early might give certain people time to clean up records or coordinate stories. And so Naomi had spent the last several weeks living like a ghost, renting a small apartment under her middle name, driving a sedan that was well over 10 years old, with a dent in the rear bumper she had never bothered to fix. She came to headquarters that morning with no escort, no assigned security detail, and no visible insignia announcing her rank, because she had wanted, just once before the cameras and the paperwork and the introductions began, to see the department exactly as it was when nobody thought anyone important was watching. It was a habit from her federal years, the belief that culture reveals itself most honestly in the moments before anyone knows they are being evaluated. She had learned that lesson the hard way early in her career, back when she was a young investigator fresh out of training, watching senior agents behave one way in front of superiors, and an entirely different way once the cameras and the paperwork disappeared. That early lesson had shaped nearly every decision she made afterward, and it was the same instinct that had carried her, quietly and without fanfare, through the front gate of a department that had no idea who she really was. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood on the eastern edge of a mid-sized city, Naomi had watched her own father, a transit mechanic who had never once raised his voice at a customer, even when they raised theirs at him, absorb small daily indignities with a patience she had not understood until she was much older. He used to tell her that a person's character showed up clearest in the moments when disrespect was easy and consequence-free, and that anyone could behave decently when they were being watched or rewarded for it. She had carried that idea with her through college, through the academy, through 2 decades of federal service, and it had become something closer to a personal code than a piece of advice. It was why, on her very first morning, as the incoming chief of a department she had never set foot in, she had chosen to walk through the front gate exactly as any ordinary new hire would, with a canvas bag over her shoulder and nothing to signal the authority she was about to carry. At the front gate, a lieutenant named Travis Monroe took one look at her canvas bag and her uniform, which admittedly bore none of the polish of a department issue, and decided within a second and a half that she did not belong there. He laughed, loud enough for the officers behind him to hear, and asked whether she had bought the uniform online. A few of them laughed along with him, the kind of laughter that comes not from something being genuinely funny, but from a group instinct to side with whoever is speaking the loudest. Travis had been with the department for 9 years, well-liked among a certain circle of colleagues, known for being quick with a joke, and quicker still to assume the worst about anyone who did not immediately fit his idea of who belonged inside that building. He had built a modest reputation as a dependable, if unremarkable, officer, the kind of person whose file contained no formal complaints, not because none had ever been warranted, but because the people most likely to complain about him had learned, over time, that doing so rarely changed anything. A pair of sergeants standing closer to the doors exchanged a glance and a low chuckle of their own, neither of them bothering to step in, both apparently content to let the moment play out as entertainment before the start of their shift. It was a small thing, that shared glance, the kind of gesture that would ordinarily vanish from memory within minutes, but weeks later, when the footage was reviewed frame by frame, it would become one of the more damning pieces of evidence in the entire case, a silent record of just how normalized this kind of treatment had become inside the department's own walls. Naomi did not raise her voice. She reached into her canvas bag and produced her federal identification, along with a sealed envelope bearing the official seal of the mayor's office, the very documents that confirmed her appointment as the incoming chief of the Westbridge Police Department. Travis did not read either one. He grabbed the sealed envelope from her hand, tore it open without looking at its contents, and let it fall to the wet pavement, as though it were nothing more than a piece of junk mail. A young female officer standing nearby took a half step forward, some instinct telling her that something was very wrong, and reached down as if to help pick the papers up off the ground. Travis snapped at her, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 3 years on the job and absolutely no self-awareness, telling her not to assist someone who was clearly lying about her credentials. The young officer froze where she stood, her hand still halfway extended, unsure whether obedience or conscience should win. Naomi crouched down herself to gather the scattered papers, her movements calm, almost deliberate, the posture of someone who had been underestimated before and had learned that dignity was not something other people could take from her, no matter how hard they tried. As she reached for the last page, Travis slapped her hand away, hard enough that several officers standing nearby visibly flinched. And then, in a moment that would replay on every screen in that department for weeks afterward, he struck her across the face with an open palm, the sound of it cracking through the cold morning air and silencing the entire formation. Her cap fell from her head and rolled across the concrete, coming to rest near a drainage grate as though the city itself wanted a front-row seat to what had just happened. For a long moment, nobody moved. Somewhere in the back of the formation, an older officer who had been on the force for nearly 30 years felt something twist in his stomach. A recognition that what he had just witnessed crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, but like everyone else standing there, he said nothing. The young female officer who had tried to help earlier, a rookie named Casey Whitfield who had joined the department less than a year before, stood, frozen at the edge of the formation with her hands clenched at her sides, torn between the instinct to step forward and the very real fear of what speaking up might cost her this early in her career. She had watched Travis humiliate other people before, junior officers mostly, people too new or too vulnerable to push back, and every time she had told herself that saying something would only make her a target without changing anything. This time felt different, though she could not yet articulate why, and the discomfort of her own silence sat heavy in her chest long after the formation was dismissed. She would remember, months later, that the woman on the ground had not looked afraid in that moment, only tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who had been in this exact position, in one form or another, more times than she cared to count. Across the lot, a maintenance worker who had been unloading supplies from a delivery truck happened to catch the entire exchange from a distance, close enough to see, but too far to intervene. He would later tell a coworker that he had never seen anything like it in the 11 years he had been servicing the building, and that something about the woman's composure afterward, the way she had simply reached for her notebook, instead of raising her voice, had stayed with him the rest of the day. Word of the incident began to travel through the building even before the 8 o'clock meeting was called. Hushed conversations passed between officers changing shifts, none of them yet aware of the identity of the woman at the center of it, all of them sensing only that something had happened that morning, which the department would not easily explain away. What surprised everyone who had gathered that morning was not the slap itself, though that alone would have been enough to end a career on any given day, but what happened afterward. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not pull out a phone to record the moment, though at that point there was no need. since the department's own cameras had already captured every second of it from 3 separate angles. She simply straightened her spine, touched her cheek once with 2 fingers, as though confirming to herself that yes, this had actually happened, and then asked Travis, in a tone so level it was almost more unsettling than anger would have been, for his full name and badge number. Travis laughed again, though there was a thinner edge to it now, and asked whether she planned on filing some kind of complaint against him. She said nothing in response. Instead, she opened the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, the same notebook she had carried through 22 years of federal investigations, and began writing. She wrote down Travis's name. Beside it, she wrote down the names of 2 sergeants who had laughed loudest during the exchange, along with the name of a security guard stationed near the entrance, who had watched the entire incident unfold without lifting a finger to intervene. She wrote the time, down to the minute. She wrote a short, clinical description of what had occurred, the kind of language a person uses when they know that someday this exact page might be read aloud in a courtroom or a disciplinary hearing. While she wrote, an older administrative employee who had been organizing paperwork near the entrance doors happened to glance out through the glass and notice something on Naomi's collar that made her stop entirely and stare. It was a small pin, easy to miss, unless a person knew exactly what to look for, the kind issued only to command staff during a very specific and very brief transition period between appointment and formal installation. The administrator's coffee cup nearly slipped from her hand. Her name was Dorothy Fenwick, and she had worked in that building for nearly 26 years, long enough to have processed the paperwork for every chief the department had appointed since the early days of her career. She recognized the pin immediately because she herself had prepared a small stack of identical pins only the week before, under strict instructions from the mayor's office, to keep their purpose confidential until the formal announcement. Dorothy set her coffee down with trembling hands and moved quickly toward the side door, torn between rushing outside to intervene and the fear that doing so might somehow make the situation worse before she fully understood what was happening. By the time she reached the parking lot, the confrontation had already ended, and all that remained was Naomi calmly writing in her small notebook while Travis stood nearby, his earlier bravado visibly draining out of him as uncertainty crept into its place. Dorothy said nothing to either of them in that moment, choosing instead to hurry back inside and place an urgent call to the mayor's office, her voice shaking as she relayed what she had just witnessed. By 8 o'clock that morning, every officer in the building had been summoned to the largest conference hall in the department, the kind of gathering usually reserved for retirements, funerals, or the announcement of a new chief. Word had spread overnight that a new chief would be introduced that day, and the rumor mill inside the department, as rumor mills tend to do, had spun out a dozen different theories about who this mysterious replacement might be. Some officers speculated it would be a man, since every chief in the department's 112-year history had been a man. Others guessed it would be some retired general brought in to whip the department into shape, or a well-connected transplant from a federal agency somewhere out east. Nobody, not a single person in that room, considered for even a moment that the woman who had been humiliated and struck in the parking lot less than 90 minutes earlier might be the very person they were about to welcome as their new commanding officer. When the double doors at the front of the hall opened, a hush spread through the room, the way it does just before a storm breaks. Naomi walked in wearing the same uniform from that morning, the faint red mark still visible along the curve of her cheekbone, her canvas bag now replaced by a black leather folder tucked under one arm. She did not rush. She did not look away from anyone. She walked to the front of the room with the same unhurried gait she had used crossing the parking lot 2 hours earlier, and the sight of her, mark and all, standing at the podium sent a wave of confusion rippling through rows of officers who were only now beginning to connect what they were seeing with what some of them had witnessed outside. The mayor stood first, followed by the city's commissioner of public safety and a representative from the state's law enforcement oversight board, all three of them rising in near unison as though choreographed. The mayor's voice carried across the silent hall as he made the introduction official, presenting to the department its new chief of police, a woman with more than 2 decades of federal investigative experience, a reputation for dismantling corrupt networks from the inside, and a mandate directly from the city council to reform a department that had, in recent years, drawn increasing scrutiny from the public it was meant to serve. He explained, for the benefit of those hearing it for the first time, that the search committee had reviewed candidates from departments across the country before settling on someone whose record made clear she would not be swayed by internal politics or old loyalties, someone whose entire career had been built on the simple, uncomfortable premise that no rank was above accountability. He said her name clearly, Chief Naomi Ellison, and the room did not so much react as freeze entirely, hundreds of officers sitting in stunned silence as the weight of what had happened that morning settled over them like a physical thing. Whispered questions rippled backward through the rows of seated officers as people began piecing together what the introduction meant, some of them turning to neighbors to ask in hushed voices whether this was truly the same woman who had been struck at the front gate only hours earlier. A captain, seated near the front, a woman who had worked alongside Travis for several years and considered him a friend, felt her stomach drop as the pieces clicked into place, understanding immediately the scale of what her colleague had just done to himself, and more importantly, to every person who had ever been dismissed or mistreated by someone wearing that same uniform. The mayor continued speaking for several more minutes, outlining the timeline for Naomi's formal installation and the priorities she intended to bring to the department, but very few people in that hall could have repeated a single word of it afterward, their attention consumed entirely by the woman standing at the podium, with a fading red mark still visible along her cheekbone. Travis Monroe sat near the back of the hall, his face draining of color so quickly that the officer beside him would later describe it as watching a man turn to stone in real time. His hands trembled in his lap, and he found himself unable to look up toward the podium, unable to reconcile the woman standing there in full command presence with the person he had mocked and struck less than 2 hours before. Nobody in that room could quite believe it either. The woman who had just been humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses, who had been accused of impersonating an officer and struck across the face for it, was in fact the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the entire city, the person every single officer in that hall now answered to directly. The room waited, almost breathlessly, for Naomi to turn her fury loose on the department, to name Travis publicly, to demand his badge on the spot, in front of everyone, as a show of power meant to establish exactly who was now in charge. Instead, she stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone once, and told the room, in a voice that carried no trace of the anger anyone expected, that she had not yet made any decisions regarding what had occurred that morning. She said she believed in evidence, not impressions, and that before any disciplinary action was taken against anyone, she wanted a complete and thorough accounting of exactly what had happened. She requested, before the meeting had even concluded, that every camera covering the front gate, the parking lot, and the main hallway leading into the building be preserved and reviewed, along with a full 72 hours of footage leading up to that morning. She informed the room that an independent legal and compliance team, one she had already arranged to bring in from outside the department, would be conducting the review rather than anyone currently on staff, since she had learned long ago that internal reviews conducted by internal staff rarely produced results anyone could trust. She said simply that she believed only in evidence, nothing more and nothing less, and that statement alone was enough to send a current of quiet dread through certain corners of the room, among officers who understood, even if they could not have said exactly why, that this woman intended to look far deeper than anyone had anticipated. The independent team arrived the following morning, 3 investigators with backgrounds in civil rights law and forensic auditing, none of them familiar with anyone inside the Westbridge department, and none of them beholden to the informal loyalties that had protected certain officers for years. They set up in a windowless room on the 3rd floor, away from the general flow of foot traffic, and began the painstaking work of cataloging footage, cross-referencing timestamps against personnel schedules, and building a timeline of events that left no room for the selective memory some officers might otherwise have relied upon. Naomi visited the room briefly each morning, before the rest of the building had fully woken up, reviewing progress with the same quiet discipline she brought to every part of the job, never once raising her voice or pushing the team toward a predetermined conclusion, insisting instead that the evidence be allowed to speak for itself, no matter where it led. Word of the outside investigators spread through the department within days, and the reaction split cleanly along lines that would come to define the following months. Officers with nothing to hide largely welcomed the scrutiny, some even expressing quiet relief that someone was finally looking seriously at issues they had privately worried about for years. Others grew visibly anxious, avoiding the third floor entirely, suddenly developing a great deal of interest in whether their own past conduct might resurface under this kind of careful examination. Naomi noticed the shift in atmosphere, but said little about it publicly, understanding that the discomfort rippling through certain corners of the building was itself a kind of evidence, a sign of exactly how much had been allowed to go unexamined for far too long. Over the following 2 days, as the independent compliance team began pulling footage and cross-referencing timestamps, Naomi sat in a borrowed office with the door closed, reviewing hours of recorded material with the same patient. Unblinking focus she had once applied to federal corruption cases that had taken years to unravel. What she found in that footage went far beyond the incident involving her own arrival. Working backward through weeks and then months of archived recordings, she began to notice a pattern that repeated itself with uncomfortable regularity near the very same entrance where she had been struck. Members of the public, particularly those from lower-income neighborhoods, were shown being addressed with a harshness and suspicion that seemed to evaporate entirely whenever a visitor arrived dressed in business attire or driving an expensive vehicle. She noted case after case involving residents who appeared to have been treated with open hostility during routine visits. Individuals turned away without explanation, people from immigrant communities spoken to in tones that bordered on contempt, and black residents in particular, subjected to a level of scrutiny and suspicion that white visitors during the same time windows simply never experienced. It became clear to Naomi, as she worked her way methodically through the footage, that what had happened to her that morning was not an isolated incident born from one lieutenant's poor judgment, but rather a visible symptom of something that had been allowed to fester inside the department for years, a quiet culture of favoritism and prejudice that had never been seriously challenged, because no one with the authority to challenge it had ever been willing to look. She discovered something else as well, something that troubled her far more than the pattern of mistreatment itself. Several blocks of footage from key dates over the past 2 years appeared to have been deliberately deleted from the department's primary servers, gaps that lined up suspiciously with dates on which formal complaints had been filed against specific officers. Whoever had done this had assumed, reasonably enough given how the department had operated in the past, that deleting footage from the primary system would be the end of the matter. What they had not accounted for was the city's independent backup infrastructure, a redundant storage system installed years earlier, under a different administration, and largely forgotten by everyone except the small technical team responsible for maintaining it. Naomi had that team pull the archived copies within 48 hours, and what she found there confirmed every suspicion the missing footage had raised. Among the recovered files was a recording from nearly a year earlier showing an elderly man from a nearby immigrant community attempting to file a report after his small grocery store had been vandalized overnight. The footage showed him waiting at the front counter for the better part of an hour, while officers walked past him without acknowledgement, eventually being turned away by a desk sergeant who told him, with visible impatience, to come back another day. Another recovered clip showed a teenager from a low-income housing complex being questioned outside headquarters for nearly 20 minutes over what turned out to be nothing more than riding a bicycle that matched a vague description from an unrelated call, the tone of the questioning officer growing sharper and more accusatory, even as the boy calmly and repeatedly gave the same consistent answers. Naomi watched each of these recordings twice, taking notes in the same small notebook she had used at the front gate, and with each new file, the shape of the problem facing her became clearer and more disheartening. What troubled her most was not any single incident, since individual lapses in judgment happened in every department, no matter how well run, but the consistency of the pattern across so many different officers and so many different shifts. It suggested something learned rather than isolated, a set of unspoken assumptions about which residents deserved patience and which did not, passed down quietly from senior officers to junior ones over years until it had become simply how things were done, rarely questioned, and almost never punished. Naomi understood from her federal years that this kind of culture was far harder to root out than a single corrupt individual, because there was no single person to blame, and no single policy change that could undo it. It would require sustained, uncomfortable work across every level of the department, and she began preparing for exactly that kind of long campaign, even as the investigation into the incident at the front gate continued to unfold around her. Armed with what the compliance team had uncovered, Naomi opened a formal internal investigation, the scale of which the department had never seen in its entire history. More than 31 separate personnel files were flagged for deeper review. 14 officers, ranging from patrol-level positions up through several supervisory ranks, were placed under active scrutiny, pending the outcome of interviews and evidence review. Multiple individuals in command positions, people who had spent years assuming their rank insulated them from consequences, suddenly found themselves being asked pointed questions by investigators, who did not report to anyone inside the department, and therefore had no reason to soften their approach. The atmosphere inside Westbridge headquarters shifted almost overnight. Some officers, particularly those with the most to lose, pushed back hard, filing grievances against the investigation itself, questioning Naomi's authority, whispering in hallways that she was overreaching, that she was targeting good officers over what amounted to nothing more than a misunderstanding at the front gate. Others, and this group grew steadily larger as the days passed, found themselves speaking up for the first time in years, sharing stories they had kept quiet out of fear of retaliation, describing incidents of favoritism and mistreatment they had witnessed, but never felt safe enough to report. A young officer who had been on the force for less than 2 years told investigators she had watched supervisors wave off complaints from residents in certain neighborhoods without so much as writing an incident report, simply because those complaints came from people the department had quietly decided did not matter as much as others. Naomi addressed the department directly during this period, her words measured but unmistakably firm, telling every officer under her command that a uniform was not a license to look down on the people it was meant to serve. She reminded them that the badge carried an obligation, not an entitlement, and that from this point forward, the department would be judged not by how it treated the people who had power and money, but by how it treated the people who had neither. Word of her approach spread quickly beyond the walls of headquarters, reaching the local press, reaching city council members who had spent years fielding complaints about the department with little to show for it, reaching residents who had long since stopped expecting anything to change. A local newspaper ran a lengthy feature on the investigation several weeks in, interviewing residents who described, some for the very first time, incidents of mistreatment they had never bothered reporting, because they assumed nothing would come of it. The elderly grocery store owner whose case had surfaced in the archived footage was among those interviewed, and he told the reporter that he had stopped expecting fair treatment from the department years earlier, resigned to the idea that people like him simply were not a priority. When investigators reached out to him personally to apologize and to inform him that the officers involved in his case were being formally reviewed, he wept, telling his daughter afterward that he had never imagined anyone in a position of real authority would ever bother to look back at what had happened to him. City council members who had spent years introducing oversight measures that quietly died in committee suddenly found themselves with a genuine ally inside the department, someone with both the authority and the will to implement the kind of accountability structures they had been proposing for years without success. Naomi appeared before the council twice in the span of 2 months, presenting detailed reports on the investigation's progress without exaggeration or defensiveness, answering even the most pointed questions with the same even, factual tone she used in every other setting. Her credibility, which had begun that first morning as an open question in the minds of officers who did not yet know her, grew steadily stronger with every week that passed, built not on promises but on the visible, methodical work of someone who did exactly what she said she would do. Roughly 3 weeks into the investigation, Travis Monroe requested a private meeting with the chief, a request that surprised nearly everyone who heard about it, since Travis had spent the preceding weeks avoiding Naomi's presence entirely, taking circuitous routes through the building to avoid crossing paths with her in a hallway. When he finally sat across from her in her office, he did something none of his colleagues had expected. He apologized, not, as Naomi noted carefully while listening, because she had turned out to be his superior and he feared for his career, but because somewhere in the weeks since that morning, forced to sit with what he had done and watch its consequences unfold across the department, He had come to understand the deeper truth of what his actions had revealed about himself. He told her that he had judged her before she had said more than a few words, that he had looked at the color of her skin and the age of her uniform, and decided, in less time than it takes to draw a breath, that she did not belong. Naomi listened to him without interrupting, her expression unreadable, the same calm she had carried since the morning he struck her. When he finished speaking, she told him plainly that forgiveness, if it came at all, was a personal matter between the two of them, something she would decide in her own time and for her own reasons. But she made it equally clear that professional accountability was an entirely separate matter, one that belonged to policy and to law, and that nothing about his apology would alter the course of the ongoing investigation. There would be no special exceptions, no quiet arrangements made because he had found the courage, weeks too late, to admit what he had done. The investigation, she told him, would proceed exactly as it would for anyone else in his position, and he nodded, understanding, perhaps for the first time, what genuine accountability actually looked like when it was not softened by rank or relationships. In the weeks that followed, the disciplinary board reviewed Travis's case alongside dozens of others, weighing the severity of his conduct against his years of otherwise unremarkable service. He was ultimately stripped of his rank and suspended, without pay for an extended period, with formal conditions attached to any future reinstatement, including mandatory retraining and continued oversight of his conduct should he choose to remain with the department at all. Several of his former colleagues distanced themselves from him during this period, uncomfortable with how visibly his behavior had exposed a culture they had all, in one way or another, been complicit in maintaining through their own silence. Casey Whitfield, the young officer who had frozen at the edge of the formation that first morning, was among the few who later testified honestly and in detail about what she had witnessed, telling investigators that she wished she had spoken up sooner, not just that day, but on the many earlier occasions when she had watched similar behavior go unchallenged. Naomi made a point, in the months that followed, of mentoring Casey personally, recognizing in the younger officer's quiet regret the same instinct toward integrity that had shaped her own career, an instinct that simply needed the right environment to grow without fear. Months passed, and the department that emerged on the other side of that investigation bore little resemblance to the one Naomi had walked into on her first morning. New training programs were introduced across every division, covering professional ethics, the recognition and correction of unconscious bias, and clear standards of accountability for how officers were expected to treat every member of the public, regardless of their appearance, their neighborhood, or their income. Supervisors who had once turned a blind eye to mistreatment found themselves required to document every complaint that crossed their desk, with those records subject to periodic audit by an office that answered directly to the chief, rather than to anyone within the traditional chain of command. Naomi also established a community advisory board made up of residents from the very neighborhoods that had historically received the harshest treatment, giving them a direct and ongoing channel to raise concerns without having to navigate the department's usual bureaucratic layers. The elderly grocery store owner agreed, after some persuasion, to serve as one of its founding members, telling a reporter later that year that he had never expected to sit across a table from a police chief and be asked, sincerely, what the department could do better. Officers who completed the new training programs were paired for a period with veteran mentors chosen specifically for their demonstrated fairness in the field, a practice Naomi borrowed from her federal years, having seen firsthand how much faster good habits took root when they were modeled directly, rather than simply lectured about in a classroom. Complaints filed against officers dropped noticeably within the first 2 quarters, after the reforms took hold, and more importantly, the complaints that continued to come in were, for the first time in years, actually being investigated and resolved rather than quietly filed away. Slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, the trust between the department and the community it served began to rebuild. Residents who had once avoided the police station entirely now finding themselves treated with a consistency and respect that had simply not existed before. Local business owners who had once viewed patrol officers with wary suspicion began speaking of certain among them by name and with something approaching genuine warmth. Teachers at the elementary school, 2 blocks from headquarters, reported that officers now showed up regularly for reading programs and afternoon safety talks, building relationships with children long before those children ever had reason to fear or distrust a uniform. None of it happened quickly, and Naomi never claimed otherwise in her public reports to the council, always careful to describe the progress as fragile and ongoing, rather than complete. But the direction of change was undeniable to anyone who had known the department, both before and after her arrival. During a ceremony held several months later to swear in a new class of officers joining the department, Naomi stood at the same podium where she had first been introduced as chief, and in her hand, she held the very cap that had rolled across the wet concrete on that first morning, kept all this time in a drawer in her office, as a quiet reminder of where the department had started. She told the young officers gathered before her, their faces bright with the particular seriousness of people about to take an oath they intended to keep, that what made a good officer was never the rank stitched onto their shoulder or the authority granted by their badge. What mattered, she said, was how a person chose to treat someone with less power than themselves in the moment when nobody else was watching, when there were no cameras rolling and no superiors present to judge the outcome. That, she told them, was the only measure of character that had ever truly counted, in this profession or in any other. The hall rose to its feet in applause that lasted far longer than ceremony required, a sound that seemed to carry something more than mere politeness, something closer to genuine hope. The recording equipment near the stage slowly pulled back from the podium as the ceremony wound to its close, capturing one final wide shot of the room before the feed cut away. The uniform Naomi wore that day looked, in almost every visible respect, exactly like the one she had worn on her very first morning in Westbridge. The same fabric, the same insignia, the same weight across the shoulders. But something fundamental had shifted in the months between those two mornings, something that had nothing to do with fabric or insignia at all. No one in that department, not anymore, would look at the person wearing that uniform and assume, based on nothing more than appearance, that they understood the whole of who stood before them. The lesson had been paid for in humiliation and in the slow, difficult work of rebuilding something broken, but it had been learned, and it would not soon be forgotten by anyone who had been there to see it happen. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, Naomi kept working the way she always had, quietly, methodically, without any particular interest in praise or public recognition for what the department had accomplished under her leadership. She continued reviewing case files late into the evening, continued walking the halls of headquarters unannounced, just as she had on that first foggy morning, continued treating every officer she encountered, from the newest recruit to the most senior commander, with the same measured respect, regardless of their rank. Some nights, alone in her office, long after the rest of the building had emptied out, she would find herself thinking back to that first morning at the gate, to the sound that had echoed across the parking lot and silenced an entire formation, and she understood now, with a clarity that had only grown sharper with time, that the moment had never really been about her at all. It had been about every person who had ever walked into that building and been judged before they said a word, every resident who had been waved away because of where they lived or how they looked, every officer who had watched something wrong happen and stayed silent because speaking up felt more dangerous than staying quiet. Her appointment as chief had given her the authority to change policy, to open investigations, to demand accountability where none had existed before. But the deeper change, the one she cared about most, was the slow and difficult work of teaching an entire institution to see the people in front of it clearly, without the distortion of assumption, without the easy shortcut of judging a person by the surface of things. She thought often, in those quiet late evenings, about her father, gone now for nearly a decade, and about the patience he had carried through a working life, spent absorbing small daily indignities without ever once losing sight of his own worth. She understood now, in a way she had not fully grasped as a younger woman, that his patience had never been passive, that it had been its own quiet form of resistance, a refusal to let other people's ignorance define the shape of his character. She had carried that same refusal with her through the academy, through 2 decades of federal investigations, and through a single cold morning at a gate where a stranger had decided, in less time than it takes to draw breath, that she did not belong. She had proven him wrong, not with anger, but with the accumulated weight of 22 years of discipline and the unglamorous, patient work of doing the job correctly long after anyone was still watching, to see if she would. That work was never finished. Not really. Not in any department, not in any city. But Westbridge had taken its first real steps down that road, and it had taken them because one morning, a woman in a worn uniform had refused to answer cruelty with cruelty, choosing instead the far harder path of patience, evidence, and quiet, unshakable resolve. Years from now, long after the specifics of that first morning had faded from department memory, new officers would still hear some version of the story during their earliest days of training. A story about a chief who had once been struck at her own front gate and had responded not with vengeance, but with the slow, deliberate work of building something better. And somewhere in that telling, whether the details stayed perfectly accurate or not, the essential truth of it would remain intact, a reminder that the measure of a person and of an entire institution was never found in how loudly it defended its own reputation, but in how carefully it treated the people who had the least power to demand anything at all.